Well, you get past the 6th of January and you're empty. You're down. You're feeling low. And even though this week has been a remarkable week of blue skies, and the sun slanting sideways and long shadows on the beach. And I walked the beach this morning and I couldn't but feel grateful to be alive and to be, fortunate enough to be working in Donegal so that I can be doing a podcast like this and then walk down on the beach. I think of people who are in hell, suffering, oppression, poverty, hunger, and war. And here I am walking along the beach in tranquility. Not that there isn't a war going on inside me too, because there is. There always is. There's always a war going on inside you. There's voices conflicting inside you all the time. And I suppose sometimes I kind of submit my voice to the narrative of the Christian tradition. And that calms me. It relaxes me. It does something good to my mental health at this time of year. I can't understand why it is that way. I can't explain how the mind works like that, but I'm sharing that it does. And what I share in the podcast is the most personal of anything that I could share with anybody. I don't get any more personal than this. And it's beautiful to do it. It's beautiful. I know you're there. More and more I meet people who are listening to the podcast. And I feel so grateful that you are listening. I feel like I know nothing. What am I sharing? Because I don't know anything. Because part of embodying faith is letting go of what you think you know. There's a line somewhere way back in the early church, one of the bishops, maybe in the 3rd or 4th century, says, love is another form of knowing. I think that what I'm sharing is just stories, And I share my faith because that's my story. And the key to it is the confusion. And that's just something to always keep in mind. I think that if you fall into religious behaviour and you develop a kind of certainty, I'd say that's the thing to be wary of. That's all I'm saying. It's the thing to be wary of. Certainty. We're coming up to 4 o'clock. The light will soon be going from the sky. I don't think you can hear those chimes. They're in the room and they're very loud in the room, but I have a suspicion that you can't hear them very well. Anyway, what I was sharing with you was that if you fall into a kind of a certainty about religious practices, that you begin to think you know why you're practicing as a Christian, or you know why you're practicing as a Buddhist, you're on top of it intellectually, I think that's the time to start worrying. And I think if you feel every so often confused and bewildered, and you feel that sometimes the fervour of religious devotion, it falls away from you like snow off a rope, I think that's the time to be grateful and realise this is working well. that just is my instinct. It's the way that religion needs to work. It's like very fluid. It's like it covers you and then it dissolves. It kind of warms you up and then it dissolves. And then it comes back when you least expect it. And so sometimes I get really warmed up with sort of, Christian prayer. The disposition of prayerfulness to the world around me. The room around me, the beach around me, the laneway or the woods or the city street around me. I kind of get into a disposition of devotion. I'm looking at the world around me and I'm thinking, this is a veil. And sometimes it's like the veil hides God, so you can't see God. It's just like you can see the reality around you. But sometimes the veil reveals God. Like you look at the tree or the bird or the beach, the waves, and it's like the waves are God. Not in themselves as God, but that they are a veil that reveals God. His presence is like underneath things. And that's what I call a sort of a devotional disposition. You can be walking around with that. You can live that at any time of the day or night. And there's a big thing which I'll talk about in next week's podcast, but that's the whole idea of embodiment, that faith is about embodying. It's not about ideas. When you say, if you're a Christian, you say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. They're ideas. But they also exist as an embodiment. I'll talk about that in the next podcast, but for now let me just say that this feeling of fervour or kind of enthusiasm for religion that you might get, don't be afraid when it falls away. It's supposed to do that. That's the way it goes. It's not supposed to solidify into ideas. If it solidifies into ideas, that's the time to worry. If you end up with a whole lot of ideas in your head about the right way to live, then start worrying. But if you feel bewildered and confused and like empty, sometimes it's like this sense of God's presence can be like, it fills you with a heat, with a warmth, with a glow, with just a good feeling. And then there's other times it just drains away from you. It's like when your energy drains away from you. When you're tired, 9 o'clock in the morning, and you just love to meet somebody. It's like, oh yeah, you're on the phone to them and you say, we'll meet for lunch. And you're just so excited about meeting them and being with them for lunch and having an old chat and a gossip. And then there's other times that you might say that and you might go and you might meet the person and suddenly you're sitting in the restaurant with plates of salad looking across at the other person and thinking, I'm sorry I arranged this because I'm just too tired to listen to this fella. It's the relationship with God is the same. It's like you get this, rush of enthusiasm, rush of heat inside you, like, oh, it's lovely. And then you wake up some morning and it's all gone. You feel empty. You feel like that old religion is ridiculous. But that's the way it's supposed to work, in my opinion. And sometimes I find it helpful when the tide goes out in my sort of fervour for the Christian gospel and I feel empty. That can be a really good time to do Buddhist practice. Buddhist practice is so in a sense, clinical. There's not the same emotion for the otherness of God, or for the kind of sense of, a deity who's wrapping their arms around you. There's a lot of logic in Buddhism, that life is impermanent, and that everything is suffering, and that in some sense renunciation, compassion, and a sense of never being certain about the truth, that those three pillars are the kind of pillars of wisdom, pillars of joy. It's kind of Buddhism is always logical steps. Or should I say psychological steps. And so you can be doing Buddhism, and then that goes. You wake up some morning and even that's gone. You feel like, oh, am I doing something wrong because now it's all collapsed on me, It's like when you're a child and something breaks, and you feel disappointed because it breaks, so you feel that somebody's going to blame you for breaking it. And it's the same sometimes with religion. You feel like the faith has vanished. You don't have any faith. You can see through all that crap of religion, and you see the world as it is. The world is nasty and negative and secular and demeaning, and everything is suffering and ends up in the catastrophe of death and annihilation. And, the dystopian sensibility that so many of us humans are beginning to breathe in and out. And I think that for me, in those moments, I try and go with them. I try and say, okay, this is the truth now. No panic. Life is meaningless. Okay, no panic. And so if you say life is meaningless, okay, no panic, it brings you into the present moment. It's like saying, I don't care how dark it is, I'm accepting it. And that means I'm here and I'm now and I'm accepting it. I accept this darkness. I don't know, maybe that's Stoicism. Maybe Stoics were like that. But it's accepting the darkness, and then when the kind of flood of joyfulness comes into you, and without any reason or logic, you fill up with a sense of wonder and love, and the next morning you get up and you're in great form. The trick is that you accept that as well. You accept both. You accept being really happy, and you accept the times when you're really unhappy. And to both of them you say, yeah, this is it. This is what it is. This is the truth. And now you can see that truth is sort of fluid because you're fluidly moving from light to darkness. You're, one day good and one day down. The songs, oh, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Oh, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Lord, hallelujah. And then the verse says, sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yeah, Lord. Sometimes I'm almost through the ground. Oh, yeah, Lord. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Sometimes I'm almost through the ground. It's okay. Each one is okay. You're not striving to be up. You're not actually striving to get away from the darkness. Do you know, if you have a sort of a darkness in you, melancholy, sadness, loneliness, depression, you're not striving to get away from it. You're not sort of battling, I need to get away from that. I need to stop being depressed. No, you don't. You don't need to stop being depressed. In fact, you need to give yourself space to be you, whatever that is. And personally, in my experience, I have given myself space to be happy. And sometimes I give myself space to be sad and melancholic. And sometimes I find that the idea of Christian faith, it's such a beautiful message of love, unconditional love. Sometimes I feel it's like a great antidote to the darkness. But in the same way, sometimes I find that Buddhist practice is a great antidote to overexcitement, to inflated joy. You know, when you're kind of walking on air and you think, you know, my life is just so wonderful at this moment. You get an antidote to that as well, which is, it kind of detaches you, you know, it detaches you from being overly inflatedly satisfied with yourself. And then when you're down, when you're lonely, when you're sad, religious faith can actually help you to detach from that. And the way it works is not by denying either one, but by actually accepting both. By accepting always who you are in this moment. And sometimes you can construct a narrative about that and sometimes not. And what do? I share this with you because this is my story. And the real key to me as a human being is that I'm a storyteller. So I'm sure there are people who are Christians who would be disappointed if I was a representative of Christianity, because they would say, well, I'm wrong about stuff. And the same is probably true of Buddhism or any other religion that I ever speak of. But the key is that I'm not actually talking about religion. I am sharing my story. I'm sharing the most intimate thing I know, which gives me joy. It's like my therapy. And not only does it give me joy, does it lift me out from melancholy, but sometimes when I'm too high, too happy, too overinflated with a great sense of how lucky I am in my life, Buddhism can be a way of just, you know, tempering it with a kind of an equanimity. And I had a memory which I wanted to share with you, and it goes back, this is 15 years ago now, 15 years ago. And you're talking Mullingar in Midland, Ireland, where I was spending a few years. The lights went out on Nullagnaman. The relentless flow of television news and soap opera came to a standstill. I was in a lovely big dark kitchen, like a cave, with candlelight and whiskey on the table, and 3 old women around the solid fuel range, and their old men at the table, talking of rushes and horses and shooting ducks in the morning. The electricity was off for hours. The women were silent, and their busy hands were still at last, completely still, and in the candlelight their youth returned, their eyes sparkled, and their skin glowed with heat, like a forest of lanterns. "There's rushes in the field beyond the river," a man said, "near the forestry." "Rushes in Westmead," another exclaimed. "That's a disgrace." "It comes in the cattle hooves," the third fellow explained. "The cattle carry the rushes from Leitrim when they're brought in." "Isn't that a terror?" one of the women said, wiping her brow. "We don't know our own bodies." A clock ticked in the shadows, and we sat so long by candlelight that eventually the faces around me were transformed. The men dissolved into ghosts, but the women grew more beautiful in the flickering light, in the shape of stories told and shards of love remembered. And whenever death was mentioned, it was with bleak and comic relish. "There was a lady buried in Kinnegad," the woman of the house said, "and she was very rich, and she had a diamond ring on her finger, and when they locked her away in the vault, later that night one of the servants broke into her coffin, but couldn't get the ring off her finger, so he got a knife to do the job, and as the blade was going through the bone, the old lady woke up. They asked me, did I ever see a dead person? I smiled and said, too many. I recalled a woman in Fermanagh one time who lived alone with lots of cats. I used to see her at first light, standing in the porch of the shop across the street from my bungalow, waiting for hours until the shop opened. One day I went over and asked the shopkeeper who the early customer might be. He told me that the old woman had no clock and lived alone. All she ever buys is tins of cat food, he said. Months later the cat woman went missing, and a flotilla of small boats was launched to search for her on the waters of the Erne. I was in the boat that found her, face down, beneath the bridge at Trasna Island. I was working as a local curate, and so it was the first of numerous encounters I had with death along the shores of that beautiful river. Closing coffins, touching dead faces, shoveling clay into open graves, and trying to say comforting things to the broken-hearted. When I opened the front door of a house and gazed at the mourners in black suits and dresses, with red-rimmed eyes, marooned in a blue fog of tobacco smoke, I would summon up archaic words about God's will, though the words were so cliched that they stuck in my throat. And apart from duties that brought me close to the dead, there was little else to do. I had a glass house full of tomatoes, and a garden of roses, which I inherited from the previous curate. And I too had a cat that gave birth to 4 kittens in a box beside the washing machine in the utility room. I was completely alone, and had little interest in either tomatoes or roses, so even they began to wither. The roses got black spot, and the tomatoes were drenched with green fly, by the end of the summer. When I was finished telling this story, the woman of the house gazed at me as if she was seeing me for the first time. The hour was late and the whisky almost finished. The whispering voices and flickering candles had brought the dead to life. But suddenly the electricity returned. The women were disappointed and called for the lights to be turned off again. But the men would have none of it. They rose to their feet like uneasy heroes in overcoats and muck boots, clutching their lamps. They were ready for dawn, for ducks, and for the real world. It's a memory that sums up for me my entire confusion about religion. Because when I was a curate, I felt it such a privilege to be intimate and close to people who were grieving, and to have the responsibility but also the privilege that I was trying to find something to say to them. And one of the things that made me uneasy all that time was I was falling back, because there were so many people who were bereaved, and so much of the curate or the priestly life was about attending to people who were ill or dying, or the mourners who were grieving. There was so much of that. It was like I was using cliches. You know, I had to fall back on the usual phrases. And yet when I'd be using the phrases, I knew that they were empty in my heart. And I suppose because I was young at the time, I was only in my 20s, I didn't quite grasp everlasting life. I didn't quite grasp what it meant to say, yes, I believe in the resurrection. Yes, your mother is with Jesus in heaven, or phrases like that. I was using them because they were cliches. I hadn't understood anything. I hadn't experienced anything wherein those words made sense. And that's 50 years ago, or 45 years ago. Now, I still don't understand them, but I feel that through the ordinary experiences of life, I've lived through the journey of death and resurrection. I think you have too. I think we all do. I think that's the extraordinary thing about life. We actually have a natural inclination to experience it in terms of religious myth, in terms of transformation. We all incline ourselves to transformation in religious terms. We all have our deity. We all have our Christ who comes to us and dissolves the self that we have constructed and provides us from within with a new self, a new way of being, a way of being which is religious. And so I was in that situation. The lights went out, and everybody was gathered into the dark. Everybody was gathered into an imaginative realm. It felt like we weren't in the ordinary realm any longer, without the electric light, with just flickering candles, and it being Nullagnaman in 2010. In a big old house, Shandona House, in Westmeath. in the huge old kitchen of that farmhouse. There was a great sense that we had entered some kind of, not realm of ghosts. I won't say ghosts, I won't say spiritual, because when you say ghosts or spiritual, you're talking about some sort of other realm, right? You're talking about like ghosts that are in another room. But this wasn't like ghosts. This was like we were more deeply in the present moment. That's what it felt like. When you sit around and you tell stories by candlelight, you begin to feel not that there's sort of some invisible world, some sort of floating ghosts around the place that you can't see behind the curtains. No, but you begin to feel more intensely. Did you ever notice this? Like when you look at an old person or a young person, when you look at somebody by candlelight, I have to tell you, in my experience, they become divine. They become so beautiful. I've seen women, and the candlelight is flickering in their eyes, and I see their whole life, the essence of their smile comes out. It's almost like in real life we have a face, but the face is a mask. In real life we're wearing a mask, and we think that when darkness covers us, we can't see each other. It's only a candle, and you know, you can only see a little bit of shimmering expression of the face in front of you. So you think that like daylight gives you the full image and you can see the person clearly, and then candlelight, middle of the evening, middle of the night in Nullag Naman, that you're not really seeing the person. But the opposite is the case, in my experience. The opposite is the case. When you're in the candlelight, you're seeing far more deeply the other person. You're seeing them clearly at a deeper level than when they're in broad daylight, where their face and expressions cover up who they really deeply are. So that atmosphere of candlelight draws out stories from people. And it draws out stories that are mythic in terms of, you know, how people will sum up their whole 50 years of life with 3 or 4 sentences. By candlelight, people will tell you who they loved. They'll tell you the story of their life. They'll tell you about people they miss, people they loved, love that was unrequited. They'll tell you about their loneliness, their sorrow. And when you're talking by candlelight, it's very often a sense that you belong inside their story. It's almost like you just see a face in the darkness with the candle flickering, and they're sharing their life story about who they loved or how they miss and grieve for the person that has passed away. And it's like you're in their story. It's like your whole soul belongs to that story as they tell it. The story is telling your heart. These are beautiful moments by candlelight. When I was young, I used to fall in love. Once it got dark and I was at the dinner table with the beautiful woman, and the light faded in the sky outside and nobody put on the electricity, and then I'm sitting at the table looking across at herself. So you couldn't avoid falling in love. It's like the person with you in the darkness has become a metaphor. They've become a metaphor for your soul. They are your soul. You've left the realm of realism. You've entered this place of the heart. I always talk about, going into the room in the heart. You want to pray, be alone in that space that's within you. Be in there, be present in there, and listen. But when you're sitting with the candlelit, with other people, it's almost like the room of the heart is shared. It's almost like the actual room you're in becomes transformed into a sacred space. You're in a zone of the sacred, and it's now manifest, it's now embodied by the 3 or 4 people who are around the table in the candlelight. And it doesn't happen much now. We're losing all the darkness that used to flood into the corners of the rooms we lived in, and it doesn't happen. It only happens if you make it happen. And then you don't want to be lighting candles because it's not a good idea, because really and truly, they make the place smell, they get grease on the walls of the bathroom, and they're dangerous because the curtains could go up in flames and then everybody'd be burned to death. So, in general, live candles are not such a good idea. Although I used to love them in the bath. The bath with electric light is a different experience from the bath that you have with candlelight. And the room that you're in with other people, fully rinsed with electric light, is a different experience than the room you go into where there is candlelight. The power cut was one of the great excuses. It was one of the great ways that people ended up for 2 or 3 hours living by candlelight. And in my experience, it was the same as that night in Mullingar. It was like, wow, the stories that get told and the beautiful faces in the flickering light. And the way that when somebody was telling their story about their love or their joy, it was something like you felt you belonged deeply in the story, in the other person's story. I can see how theatre comes to life. I can see why I'm a storyteller, and I can also see why and how liturgy works, because liturgy is, what is it but candles? In any religion, any tradition, it's like light the candles and we'll start telling the story of the meaning of life. How the deity has helped us come to this present place, which is paradiso, heaven. There's always a sense in liturgy that you are in heaven, that the liturgical energy, spatially, and text, they're all heaven, the space, the music. You're in heaven. At the deepest level of your being, when you're in that moment, you're in heaven. And maybe that's the best description I can give of why I talk religion and why I talk. I talk it up when I feel good about it, and there's times when I don't feel good about it, and I talk that too. When faith comes into your heart and it opens your heart and you feel, oh, I'm floating on this, it's just so beautiful. Good. embrace it. And be joyful in the joy of your religion. And then when it goes from you, let it go. And embrace that moment too, that darkness, that loneliness, that emptiness. I have another memory from Christmas in the same house 15 years ago when my mother came. She arrived for Christmas without her Padre Pio prayers, so I had to download them from the internet. On Christmas morning I went to Mass alone, but just as I was taking my place, a button popped off my overcoat and rolled under the pew, and I couldn't retrieve it. Later, sitting in the Jeep in the cathedral car park, I turned on the heater fan, but the fuse blew, and I was perished by the time I arrived home. And I got a pain in the head from the stress of cooking a duck and a lump of spiced beef for 8 people on Christmas afternoon. So it wasn't all fun. But that evening, I watched my mother beside the fire, foraging for the last sweet in the box, and it made me smile. I was in the Metropole Hotel in Cork before Christmas, I told her. I had tea with Noel Bridgman, the head chef. Between sips of tea, Noel had pointed at the stairs in the foyer and said, "That stairs is where the hotel manager, Mr. Vance, used to stand in the old days to lecture the new staff. Always make the guest feel at home," he would say, and we did. One morning a guest found a waitress standing at the foot of his bed with a breakfast tray. "Your usual prunes, sir," she declared, though the guest's previous visit had been 10 years earlier. Noel cooked for Walt Disney, Gregory Peck, Vivian Leigh, and many other famous guests at the Metropole down the years. Most of them had simple tastes, except for Dawn Adams, an actress from Hollywood who asked for milk to be delivered to her room. Noel thought it was just a glass of milk she meant, but in fact she wanted buckets of it to fill the bath. The request was refused. "The jazz festival started under the stairs," Noel said. "Myself and Jim Mountjoy and Mr. Vance were sitting in there wondering what we could dream up for the end of October to bring in a few extra guests, and Jim suggested a jazz festival, and sure we all thought he was daft. I'll never forget the first night Ella Fitzgerald arrived. I was on standby to cook her anything she wanted, but all she wanted was a bowl of chicken soup. A lovely woman with simple taste. All the stars had simple tastes, although, mind you, the Clancy brothers always liked a fried egg on top of their steaks." Noel worked for almost 50 years at the Metropole, and he never missed a day except for one, as a boy, when he got blown off his feet by gas exploding from an oven. "A big ball of fire came at me and burnt my face. There wasn't even an eyelash left. And Mr. Vance said I should go home, so I did, but I came back the following morning with dark glasses and no eyebrows." Noel was wearing a double-breasted white jacket, his chef's hat, and a red neckerchief when I met him. He had been working all day, but when he went home for Christmas he intended folding his uniform and putting it away forever. I've decided to retire, he said. I asked him did he remember the famous sweet shop beside the Metropole, the Haji Bey. It was run by an Armenian who fled Turkey at the turn of the 20th century and ended up in Cork selling sweets. I told him that my mother once worked at the Metropole and that she often recalled the fragrance of exotic confectionery wafting into the foyer as guests arrived and sniffed the air. And I told my mother all this on Christmas evening. But she didn't pay much attention. She happened to be savouring the last sweet nugget of Turkish delight in the box. Well, we all had a lovely day, she declared contentedly, so you can leave me home tomorrow. I did. And in the 2 freezing weeks that followed, I sat at the window by candlelight without the electricity on, looking out at the white and foggy fields of Westmeath. My mother was sitting in Cavan at her window, and I suppose the head chef of the Metropole Hotel had plenty of time to sit at his window in Cork. All of us quietly waiting for another year to begin. And that moment, I think of it now, and it's like this moment here. It's coming up to 5 o'clock. I've been working here in the studio and the light has gone down, but I'm sitting at the microphone, so I haven't turned on any electric lights. Just the light outside fading in the sky. I think of my mother looking out the window in Cavan, all those years ago, 15 years ago, and all the journeys she had since then, until her death in 2012. And Noel, that head chef who retired that year, 15 years ago. Each of us looking out our own window. Each of us watching the fading light. Each of us without electric light, just enjoying the subtle change from day to night. And I think of the way that in Mullingar one Nullagnaman, when there were 6 of us, men and 3 women, sitting around by candlelight, together. I think of the way that we come together with candles, and we're able to tell stories. We're able to share at a very deep level by candlelight. And I think of how, in a sense, candles are the essence of all religious liturgies. Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, every single one of them, it's always about candles. And I think that sometimes I lose my faith. And sometimes I'm swelled and inflated with a confidence about my faith. And sometimes I think that, faith comes and goes. It's like the tide. I'm full of fervour for God today, and tomorrow I don't believe in God. It's like the tide that comes and goes. But I think that religion is about the candles. It's about lighting the candle, and it's about sharing the story. A story, any story, with someone else. Whether in good times or in bad, whether high and happy or low and depressed, it's like being together and sharing a story. Any story. Because religion is not about ideas. It's not an orthodoxy. It's a practice. It's embodiment. It's knowing that in the candlelight you become more intense of who you are and more intense of who the other person is. To look into the eyes of somebody you love by candlelight is an intense experience, like being kissed or embraced. And to share with somebody by candlelight a common story, a faith in a God, is an intimate experience. Because it's an embodiment. Just like in Andrei Rublev's icon of the Trinity, when he was asked to make this icon, and it took him a long time, and eventually he had 3 figures, like a prophet and 2 angels, just sitting and breaking bread and drinking wine and watching each other. And it's like what you see in their eyes in that icon is what Rublev was saying. This is how I paint the Holy Trinity, God. And that's what I feel when I sit in the candlelight with somebody else. We are embodying God. Even in the way that today we're enthusiastic about religion and tomorrow we're not. Even in the way that today we are joyful and excited and happy about the world and tomorrow we're depressed and lonely and isolated. The ups and the downs of our lives are the embodiment of God. I'm going to talk about the embodiment, that whole idea, in the next podcast next week. But for now, wherever you are at 5 o'clock, coming to the second week in January, the light going down. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.